Hi friends, today we're starting our next read aloud. I have chosen the book The Carpet People by Terry Pratchett. So funny story about this book, he actually wrote this book 2 times. Not completely over, but he wrote it the first time when he was 17. And he says that he just thought that fantasy was all magic and battles and he didn't put any more hard thought into it. So then when he was 43, he went back and started to rewrite the book. So it still has the same characters and the same setting, but he changed a lot of the ways that people do things in the book. So he says this book isn't exactly the book that his 17-year-old self would have written or his 43-year-old self would have written. So I hope you enjoy. Friends, we're gonna start with the prologue. They called themselves the Mudrungs. It meant the people, or the true human beings. It was what most people called themselves to begin with. And then, one day, the tribe meets some other people and gives them a name like the other people, or, if it's not been a good day, the enemy. If only they think up a name like some more true human beings. It'd save a lot of trouble later on. Not that the Mudrungs were in any way primitive. Pismir said that they had a rich native cultural inheritance. He meant stories. Pismir knew all the old stories and many new ones, and used to tell them while the whole tribe listened, enthralled. And the nighttime fires would crumble into ashes. Sometimes it seemed that even the mighty hares that grew outside the village stockade listened too. They seemed to crowd in closer. The oldest story was the shortest. He did not tell it often, but the tribe knew it by heart. It was a story told in many languages all over the carpet. In the beginning, said Pismir, there was nothing but endless flatness. Then came carpet, which covered the flatness. It was young in those days. There was no dust amongst the hairs, and they were slim and straight, not bent and crusty like they are today. And the carpet was empty. Then came dust, which fell upon the carpet, drifting amongst the hairs, taking root in the deep shadows. More came tumbling slowly with silence amongst the waiting hairs, until the dust was thick in the carpet. From the dust the carpet wove us all. First came the little crawling creatures that made their dwellings in burrows and high in the hairs. Then came soraths and weft-borers, tromps, goats, grumpipers, and snargs. Now the carpet had life and noise, yes, and death and silence. But there was a thread missing from the weave of the loom of life. The carpet was full of life, but did not know it, was alive. It could be, but it could not think. It did not even know what it was. And so, from the dust came us, the carpet people. We gave the carpet its name, and the name the creatures, and the weaving was complete. We were the first to give the carpet a name. Now it knew about itself. Though Frey, who hates life in the carpet, may tread upon us, though shadows grow over us, we are the soul of the carpet. And that is a mighty thing. We are the fruit of the loom. Of course, this is all metaphorical, but I think it's important. Don't you? Chapter 1. It was the law that every 10th year, the people of the tribes in the Dumi Empire would come and be counted. They did not go all the way to the capital city of Ware, but instead went to a little walled town named Tregammaras. The counting was always a great occasion. Tregammaras would double in size and importance overnight as tribal tents were pitched outside its walls. There was a horse market and a 5-day fair, old friends to meet, and a flood of news to be exchanged. And there was the counting itself. New names were added to the crackling scrolls, which the people liked to believe were taken to where, even to the great palace of the emperor himself. The doomy clerk laboriously wrote down how many pigs and goats and tromps everybody had, and one by one people shuffled on to the next table to pay their taxes in furs and skins. That was the unpopular part. So the queue wound round Tregamarus in the east gate, through the postern and stables, across the market square, and through the counting house. Even the youngest babies were carried past the clerk, for the quill pens to wobble and scratch their names in the parchment. Many a tribesman got a funny name because clerks didn't know how to spell, and there were more of that sort of thing in history than you might expect. On the 5th day, the governor of the town called all the tribal chieftains to an audience in the market square to hear their grievances. He didn't always do anything about them, but at least they got heard. He didn't always do anything but at least they got heard, and he nodded a lot, and everyone felt better about it until at least they got home. This is politics. That was how it always happened, time out of mind. And on the 6th day, the people went back to their homes along the road Doomy had built. They went east behind them. The road went west until it came to the city of Ware. There it was just one of the many roads that entered the city. Beyond Ware it became the west road, becoming narrower and winding until it reached the furthermost western outpost of the Rug. Such was the Doomy Empire. It covered almost all of the carpet, from the wood wall to the wasteland near Belisham in the north. In the west, it bordered Wildland and the uttermost fringes of the carpet, and southward, the roads ran as far as the heathlands. The painted people of the wainscot, the warlike Hiblongs, even the fire worshippers of the Rug, all paid their tributes to the emperor. Some of them didn't like Doomy much, usually because the empire discouraged the small wars and cattle raids that in the outlying regions were by way of being a recreational activity. The empire liked peace. It meant the people had enough time to earn money and pay their taxes. On the whole, peace seemed to work. So the Mudrung tribe went east and passed out the chronicles of the empire for another 10 years. Sometimes they quarreled amongst themselves, but on the whole, they lived peacefully and avoided having much to do with history, which tends to get people killed. Then, one year, no more was heard from Tregamarus. Old Grim Orkson, chieftain of the Mudrungs, had 2 sons. The eldest, Glurk, succeeded his father as chieftain when old Orkson died. To the Mudrung way of thinking, which was slow and deliberate way, there couldn't have been a better choice. Glurk looked just like a second edition of his father, from his broad shoulders to his great thick neck and the battering center of his strength. Glurk could throw a spear further than anyone. He could wrestle a snarg, and he wore a necklace of their long yellow teeth to prove it. He could lift a horse with one hand, run all day without tiring, and creep up so close to grazing animals that sometimes it would die of shock before he had time to raise his spear. Admittedly, he moved his lips when he was thinking, and thoughts could be seen bumping against another like dumplings in a stew. He was not stupid. Not what you'd call stupid. His brain got there in the end, but it just took the long way around. He's a man of few words, and he doesn't know either of what either of them mean, people said, but not when he's within hearing. One day, toward evening, he was tramping homeward through the dusty glades, carrying a bone-tipped hunting spear under one arm. The other arm steadied a long pole that rested on his shoulder. In the middle of the pole, its legs tied together, dangled a snar. At the other end of the pole was Snibbril, Glurk's younger brother. Old Orkson had married early and lived long, so a wide gap filled with a string of daughters who the chieftain had carefully married off, upright and respected, and above all, well-off mudrungs. This separated the brothers. Snibbril was slight, especially compared to his brother. Grim had sent him off to the district Doomy school in Tregamarus to become a clerk. He can't hardly hold a spear, he said. Maybe a pen be better. Get some learning in the family. When Snibbril had run away for the third time, Prismeer came to see Grim. Prismeer was the shaman, a kind of odd-job priest. Most tribes had one, though Prismeer was different. For one thing, at least once every month he watched all the bits that showed. This was unusual. Other shamans tend to encourage dirt, taking the view that the grubbier the more magical, and he didn't wear a lot of feathers and bones, and he didn't talk like the other shamans in the neighboring tribes. Other shamans ate yellow-spotted mushrooms that were found deep in the hair thickets and said things like ha-da-da-da-da, ha-da-da-da-da, ya-ya, hana. But it certainly sounded magical. Prismeer said things like, correct observation followed by meticulous deduction and the precise visualization of goals is vital to the success of any enterprise. Have you noticed that the way the wild trumps always move around 2 days ahead of the Soreth herds? Incidentally, don't eat the yellow-spotted mushrooms. Which didn't sound magical at all, but worked a lot better and conjured up good hunting. Privately, some mudrungs thought good hunting was due more to their own skill than to his advice. Prismeer encouraged this view. Positive thinking, he would say, is also very important. He was also the official medicine man. He was a lot better, they agreed, but reluctantly because the mudrungs respected tradition, than the last one they had, whose idea of medicine was to throw some bones in the air and cry, ha-ja-ja-ja, hana. Prismeer just mixed various kinds of rare dust in a bowl and made it into pills, and said things like, take one of these when you go to bed at night, and another one if you wake up in the morning. And occasionally he offered advice on other matters. Grim was chopping sticks outside his hut. It'll never work, said Prismeer, appearing behind him in that silent way of his. You can't send Snibbril off the Tregan again. He's a mudrung. No wonder he keeps running away. He'll never be a clerk. It's not in his blood. Man, let him stay. I'll see he learns to read. If you can learn him, you're welcome, said Grim, shaking his head. He's a mystery to me. Spends all his time moping around. His mother used to be like that. Of course, she got a bit of sense once she got married. Grim had never learned to read, but he had always been impressed by the clerks at Tregamarus. They would make marks on bits of parchment and could remember things. That was power, of a sort. He was quite keen to see that Orkson got some of it. So Snibbril went to Prismeer's village school with the other children and learned numbers, letters, and the Doomy laws. He enjoyed it, sucking in knowledge though his life depended on it. It often did, Prismeer said. And strangely, he also grew up to be a hunter almost as good as his brother, but in different ways. Glurk chased. Snibble watched. You don't have to chase around after creatures, Prismeer had said. You watch them for long enough, and then you'll find the place to wait, and they'll come to you. There's nearly always a better way of doing something. When Old Grim died, he was laid in a burrow dug of the dust of the carpet, with his hunting spear by his side. Mudrungs had no idea where you went when you died, but there was no reason to go hungry once you got there. Glurk became chieftain and would have to take the tribe to the next counting. But the messenger to summon them to Trig and Maris was long overdue, and that worried Glurk. Not that he was in a hurry to pay taxes, and actually going to see why the messenger was late seemed a bit too, keen. But usually the Doomy were very reliable, especially overpaying taxes. But as he and his brother wandered homeward that evening, he kept his thoughts to himself. Snibble grunted as he heaved the pole onto his other shoulder. He was shorter than his brother, and he was going to get shorter still, he thought, if he couldn't shed the load for 1 minute or two. I feel as though my feet have worn right off and my legs have turned up on end, he said. We can't stop for a rest. 5 minutes won't hurt. And my head aches. 5 minutes then, said Glurk. No more. It's getting dark. They had reached Doomy Road, and not far north of it lay Woodwall. Home and supper. So it laid Woodwall, home, and supper. They sat down. Glurk, who never wasted his time, started to sharpen and point his spear on a piece of grit. But both brothers gazed down the road, which was shining in the dim evening air. The road stretched west, a glowing line in the darkness. The hairs around it were full of growing shadows. It had fascinated Snibble ever since his father had told him that all the roads led to where. So it was only the road that lay between the doorway of his hut and the threshold of the emperor's palace. He thought, and if you counted all the streets and passages that led off the road, once you set foot on it, you might end up anywhere. And if you just sat by the road and waited, who might pass you? Everywhere was connected to everywhere else. That's what Prismeer had said. Snibble put his head in his hands. The ache was worse. It felt as though he was being squeezed. The carpet had felt wrong today too. The hunting had been hard. Most of the animals had vanished, and the dust between the hairs did not stir in the breathless air. Glurk said, I don't like this. There hasn't been anyone on the road for days. He stood up, reached out for the pole. Snibble groaned. He'd have to ask Prismeer for a pill. A shadow flickered high upon the hairs and flashed away towards the south. There was a sound so loud as to be felt by the whole body, hitting the carpet with a horrible suddenness. The brothers sprawled in the dust as the hairs around them groaned and screamed in the gale. Glurk gripped the tough bark of the hair and hauled himself upright, straining against the storm that whipped them around. Far overhead, the tip of the hair creaked and rattled, and on all sides, the hairs waved like a gray sea. Smashing through them came grit, man-sized boulders, half rolling, half flying before the wind. Holding on tightly with one hand, Glurk reached out with the other and hauled his brother to safety. When they crouched, too shaken to speak, while the storm banged around them. As quickly as it had come, it veered south, and the darkness followed it. The silence clanged like gongs. Snibble blinked. Whatever it was, it had taken the headache with it. His ears popped. When he heard the sound of the hooves on the road as the wind died away. Then he heard the sound of hooves on the road as the wind died away. The hoofbeats got louder very quickly and sounded wild and frightened, as though the horse was running free. When it appeared, it was riderless. Its ears lay back flat on his head, and its eyes flashed green with terror. The white coat glistened with sweat. Reins cracked across the saddle with a fury of the gallop. Snibble leaped in its path. Then, as the creature hurtled by him, he snatched at the reins, raced for a second alongside the pounding hooves, and flung himself into the saddle. Why he dared that he never knew. Careful observation and precise determination of goals, probably, but he couldn't imagine not doing it. The brothers rode into the village, the quieted horse carrying them and dragging the snarg behind it. The village stockade had broken in several places, and grit boulders had smashed some huts. Glurk looked towards the Orkson hut, and Snibble heard the moan that escaped from him. The chieftain climbed down from the horse's back and walked slowly towards his home, or what had been his home. The rest of the tribe stopped talking and drew back, awed, to let him pass. A hare had fallen, a big one. It crushed the stockade, and the tip of it laid across what was left of the Orkson hut. The arch of the doorway still standing bravely amid the litter of beams and thatch. Bertha Orkson came running forward with her children around her and flung herself into his arms. "Pismir got us out before the hare fell," she cried. "Whatever shall we do?" He patted her absently, but went on staring at the ruined hut. Then he climbed up the mound of wreckage and prodded about. So silent was the crowd that every sound he made echoed. There was a clink as he picked up the pot that had miraculously escaped destruction and looked at it as though he had never seen its design before, turning it this way and that in the firelight. He raised it over his head and smashed it on the ground. Then he raised his fist above him and swore. He cursed by the hares, by the dark caverns of underlay, by the demons of the floor, by the weft and by the warp. He bellowed the unutterable words and swore the oath of Rewatshud and Frugal, which cracked bones. So it was said, although Pismir claimed that it was all superstition. Curses circled up in the evening hairs, and the night creatures of the carpet listened. Oath was laid upon oath in a towering pillar, vibrating terror. When he had finished, the air trembled. He flopped down on the wreckage and sat with his head in his hands, and no one dared approach. They were sidelong glances, and one or two people shook themselves and hurried away. Snibble dismounted and wandered over to where Pismir was standing gloomy, wrapped up in his goatskin cloak. He shouldn't have said those utterable words, Pismir said, more or less to himself. It's all superstition, of course, but that doesn't say that it isn't real. Oh, hello, I see you survived. What is this? It used to be called Frey, said Pismir. I thought it was just an old story. Doesn't mean it's untrue. I'm sure it was Frey. The changes in air pressure to begin with, the animals sensed it, just like it said in the... He stopped. Just like I read somewhere, said Pismir awkwardly. He glanced past Snibble and brightened up. You got a horse, I see. I think it's been hurt. Pismir walked to the horse and examined it carefully. It's Jumi, of course, he said. Someone fetch my herb box. Something attacked him. See here, not deep, but it should be dressed. A magnificent beast. Magnificent. No rider? We rode up the road away, but we didn't see anyone. Pismir stroked the sleek coat. If you sold all the village and its people into slavery, you might be able to buy a horse like this. Whoever it belongs to, He ran away some time ago. He has been living wild for days. The Doomy don't let anyone keep slaves anymore, said Snibble. It's worth a lot, is what I'm trying to say, said Prismeer. He hummed distractedly to himself as he examined the hooves. Wherever he came from, someone must have been riding him. He let go of one leg and paused to stare up at the hares. Something scared him. Not Frey. Something days ago. It wasn't bandits because they would have taken the horse too. And they don't leave claw marks. A snarg could have made that if it was 3 times its normal size. Oh dear. And there are such, he said. The cry came. To Snibble, it seemed as though the night had grown a mouth and a voice. It came from the hares just beyond the broken stockade, a mocking screech that split the darkness. The horse reared. A fire had already been lit at the break in the wall, and some hunters ran towards it, spears ready. They stopped. On the farther side, there was a mounted shape in the darkness and 2 pairs of eyes. One was a sullen red, one pair shimmered green. They stared, unblinking, at the flames at the villagers, over the flames at the villagers. Glurk snatched a spear from one of the gaping men and pushed his way forward. Nothing but a snarg, he growled and threw. The spear stuck in something, but the green eyes only grew bigger. There was a deep, menacing rumble from an unseen throat. Be off! Go back to your lair! Prismeer ran forward with his blazing stick in his hand, and he hurled it at the eyes. They blinked and were gone. With them went the spell. Cries went up, and ashamed of their fear, the hunters surged forward. Stop! Shouted Prismeer. Idiots! You'll chase out into the darkness after that with what, your bone spears? That was a black snarg, not like the brown ones you get around here. You know the stories? They're from the farthest corners, from the unswept regions, from the north, from the White Cliffs, off the wood wall itself. Came again the cry of a snarg. This time it did not die anyway, but stopped abruptly. Prismeer stared north for a second, then he turned to Glurk and Snibble. You have been found, he said. That was what brought this horse here, fear of the snargs. And fear of the snargs is nothing to be ashamed of. Fear of snargs like that is common sense. Now that they have discovered the village, you can't stay. They'll come every night until one night you won't fight back hard enough. Leave tomorrow. Even that may be too late. We can't just, Glurk began. You can, you must. Frey is back, and all the things that come after. Do you understand? No, said Glurk. Then trust me, said Prismeer, and hope that you never do have to understand. Have you ever known me to be wrong? Glurk considered. Well, there was that time when you said about important things. No, I suppose not. Glurk looked worried. But we've never been frightened of snargs. We can deal with snargs. What's special about these? The things that ride on them, said Prismeer. There was another pair of eyes, said Glurk uncertainly. Worse than snargs, said Prismeer. Got much worse weapons and teeth and claws. They've got brains.